Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Hey, Chris. Great to be back on the show again. Been a busy times and doing a lot of interesting shows recently, which leads up a little bit to summarizing everything as well in today's show.
Yeah, today's show is more timely than a lot of our shows. A lot of times we're talking about industry and overall, but there's so much happening in the world right now in the energy industry and the economy and things, and it's all coming together. In thinking about what could happen this winter and where things are going, had me thinking that inviting this current guest was probably a good thing to get his perspective as an economist of what could happen and what we should expect from the industry and the economy as a whole through the winter.
No, and I really look forward to hearing more about it. I just read a new book which kind of looks at the world after the pandemics and the world of, according to this, the globalization is dead. Not dead, but it's paused at least, which means that we're going more and more into our own, taking care of ourselves. So it's be quite interesting to see, is this also applying to energy and not just supply chains, but how does this going to work? Not only for microgrids, for countries, for regions, for etc. So looking forward to hear a lot more around where we're heading.
Well, let's dive into it. I think to manage expectations, I'm expecting to hear a bit about the UK situation specifically, maybe a bit more European centric, but we'll see where we go. So without us pontificating much longer, let me introduce Marc Ostwald. Marc, welcome to the program.
Hello.
So Marc, Johan and I say this in every single episode. We have a good idea of who you are, but at this point, the audience may or may not know you by name. Maybe it makes sense to just take a little bit and tell us about who you are and what you do.
Okay. I'm Marc Ostwald. I'm Chief Economist for ADM Investor Services International, which is the clearing and execution arm of Archer Daniels Midland, ADM. We're really a relatively small part of it. But I work also with the parent company. My interests, I should probably fess up straight up that I'm not qualified as an economist. I'm qualified as a psychologist. But I think that's probably more useful than anything which is particularly taught in the way of economics in universities and schools nowadays, because it's basically all it is advanced mathematics, which particularly in the modern era is not great. I take my specialities really are looking at, latterly at the whole complex of commodity and energy markets, but originally I come from a fixed income foreign exchange background with something to do with equity markets. But now I tend to just sort of look at the world, big strategic picture, and I'm very much a critical and lateral thinker.
Well, I appreciate that. You heard my introduction and expectations. So let's just start with, where do you think we are? What would, go big picture. Let's look at energy where it is today. What's the current state of the energy market?
I think there's a couple of important points. The pandemic basically, and this is not only the energy sector, but it happens to be particularly acute in the energy sector. What it exposed is we've had this 30 years of technology boom, which has been facilitated by the end of the Cold War and a lot more sharing of technology. But the whole technology boom that we've had, we have, I don't really want to insult the likes of all the Samsungs and the Facebooks and the Googles of this world, but we've been frittering all of this technology away on convenience. And what we forgot to do was look at how we could improve our infrastructure. And what the pandemic did was to expose just how badly we have been underinvesting in our infrastructure. Energy infrastructure, definitely. Now, you were mentioning, I think to start with, you were talking about, how globalization, a lot of people call the death knell for it. Yes and no. The world has always been globalized. The interconnectivity hasn't gone, and it's not going to go. And what the pandemic has done is also got us away, which is a good thing, from this very narrow micro perspective on what we do. If I would almost certainly guarantee that most people had little or no appreciation of how important nat gas is for the production of fertilizer. That's one very simple thing. People didn't really understand. A lot of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a lot of problems, but a lot of what we've got at the moment, particularly in Europe, was already exposed last summer before the Russian invasion. We'd already had this expose of how basically supply chains being disrupted meant that we actually started having things laterally and critically. We had to move away from everything being just in time to just in case. We had to understand much better that actually when we talk about globalization is as much about the mobility of people. And we've suddenly had this exposure, particularly the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For instance, the merchant shipping fleet in the world, 18% of the staff are either Russian or Ukrainian. So suddenly everyone's had to start thinking about, oh, right, how does this work? And now we're in this situation where people are questioning the transition to renewable energy. Understandably so, because compromises are going to have to be made. But that's all part really of being a strategic thinker rather than a linear. I don't want to insult people, but it is results orientated and rather Pavlovian type thinker. You actually understand, you look at the supply chain and all the interconnectivities. And this is what's being exposed at the moment, particularly amongst the political fraternity. And we've moved away from, we're going to have a green recovery in Europe from the pandemic to, damn, how are we going to solve this problem? So that's where we're at. And the other thing, which I don't think, this is probably one talking point, which I don't think people quite understand. It's the way businesses are run. And for a long time, people assumed that you could hedge your energy costs. And we still seem to be in a situation when I'm looking at the market currently, that people want to hedge their energy costs. And they haven't got that flexibility and adaptability, which is going to be absolutely critical to the post-pandemic economy, whatever it actually eventually, when all the dust starts to settle. People need flexibility. They don't need a whole load of, I make this distinction between people understanding processes and then imposing procedures. The problem with procedures, when they're imposed on the process, is they're very fixed. They start to become immobile because they're basically a sign that we want to control things. Now, all our procedures in terms of the energy sector are basically being blown up. And what we've not understood is that the processes have been moving for quite some time. So what we needed to do is have some adaptability in our procedures to have a better sense of control, but we haven't done that. So now we're going through what is a brutal learning process for everybody. And as much as people are focused on the energy crisis in Europe, there's an energy crisis in the UAE, in the US, in Canada, in Latin America, definitely in China, in India. This isn't something specific to Europe. It just happens to be that Europe is so much more dependent on the imports of resources of any type than many of the rest of the world, because it always thought it could trade its way out. And that applies as much to the EU as it does to the UK.
You mentioned a little bit around hedging. There was so many questions. I was kind of just writing my notes all the time here because there was a lot to kind of grasp and to digest around this. But maybe if we touch on one of the things, you mentioned a little bit about hedging. I'm just a bit curious. You know, we're talking about an energy industry which has a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different areas, one being, of course, commodity trading. So how, if hedging is a challenge, what will the impacts once we come out and the dust settled, as you mentioned? What is the impact for energy trading moving forward?
Well, we've got to the point for a lot of traders that hedging actually has become pernicious. You end up chasing your own tail. Where one interesting comparison to make, if you look at what happened last year in the third quarter, where we had a big spike in natural gas prices, in power prices, it was very much focused in the 0 to 1 year area. In fact, a lot of it just very temporary. Now what we've got is a crisis which goes much further out. You've got 5-year forward base power load prices, which are 8-10 times what they would normally be. So you're then in a situation, whether you're a utility provider or whether you're a corporate, i.e. a taker of utility provisions, that you're saying, well, should I fix this? You've gone through the experience of last year. Oh, well, that was just a one-off. Now we're in the situation of, well, actually, Russia may cut all the resources off. And you're also you're looking at changed supply chains. And on the other hand, you're also looking at the fact that we've got an intense period of very bad weather. Climate change is very real. And so we're getting much more in the way of extreme weather, which in a lot of cases is going to require even more use of energy, or result in energy outages because of either extreme dryness. We're seeing it in the French nuclear industry at the moment. The rivers are so dry that the nuclear power industry, apart from suffering from the fact that they didn't do the maintenance during COVID, therefore they've had to have unusual maintenance periods, are now also saying, well, we can't actually cool what are some of our emissions enough. So we're going to have to operate at lower base loads. And suddenly everyone's going, oh, right, I thought France was meant to be the smart one. So in terms of this hedging, what we've got is a situation of you either bite the bullet, which for utility providers, it's a difficult choice, because what you want is a lot more in the way of contract suppliers. You need also to be able to lock in your resources as a utility provider. And you also, on the other hand, are looking at it, whether you're using futures and options or you're doing forward contracts, you're also looking at it and saying, yes, but how much should I lock in? Because at some stage you are looking at the current set of energy prices, ranging from coal up through to nuclear via renewables and anything else, and you're saying these prices can't last forever if we're going to get the sort of level of demand destruction that these levels of energy prices, given that yes, there's a certain amount you can as a whether you're a utility provider or whether you're a manufacturer requiring, there's only so much you can pass on before people just say, well, actually, that doesn't work for me anymore as a business. I just can't make the margins work. So in terms of your hedging, what you're ending up in this situation with is, right, I need to have some sort of constant in there, some sort of visibility. And this is the problem for a lot of people. They haven't got the visibility that they had. And part of the problem is also this idea of what is a constant, what is a variable. The problem with most economic modeling is that the model starts off with, right, these are the constants in our business plan, and these are the variables. Now we've got to a situation where half the constants have become variables, and they've become so wildly variable that you then have to basically think about how do I adjust to this? How do I adapt to this? What assumptions can I make? What instinctively? And this is actually where experience is going to count for a lot. I think people underestimate it. People who have experience of an industry from not being smart, but from just being there and having seen previous cycles, have a better understanding intuitively of what's likely to happen. That's not to say they are know-alls, but intuitively they can rule out certain things as likely events. And this is the nature of the complex challenge that is out there for everybody. And it's also the biggest problem is we don't have a very good group of politicians around the world.
Well, that was going to be what you're triggering as you were saying that, right? So the one variable that is still out there is what policy or what government's going to do, right? So, if it's a free market, I can probably deal and build models to that. If the government's going to step in and change or cap or do things, that the bets all change. Is that part of what you're talking about as well? Is that a major consideration of what policy is, reactive policy that may come out of the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, it inevitably is reactive policy. It's also whether people actually can get rid of sacred cows. Jones Law in the States would be a classic example, repealing that so that when you do have a problem in Texas, it doesn't start to basically create a whole big load of problems in the Northeast. So the problem in terms of politicians is most of them are on short-term cycles, and this is a long-term problem. The solution to a lot of the problems we've got at the moment is not going to come within one political electoral cycle, whether it's 4 years or 5 years or 7 years. It doesn't really matter. So politicians are so focused on, well, what's going to get me re-elected, that the risk of making a mistake is actually quite large. And so you've got things like running down the SPR. The SPR is at dangerously low levels. People now saying, yes, but demand is tailing off. But it doesn't matter. They're still going to have to replenish. And then people say, and now people are saying, well, hold on, Saudi Arabia is now talking about cutting production. And we're looking to replenish the SPR at levels which are here now. Now, we've come down from $130 to $91 on WTI, but that ain't 60 where we started at the back end of last year. So suddenly you're going, well, that's expensive. Would it, what's the right decision to make on that front? And, if we've worn down this, what should be buffer so much, what happens if something else disruptive happens? And one of my maxims of the last couple of years is anyone who says, oh, well, that couldn't possibly happen. They couldn't possibly do that. I would just go straight away, challenge. Because if there's one lesson from the last 2 years, it's assume people can behave extraordinarily badly, assume events can take what you would say is maybe a 1 in a million year chance, and build that into your assumptions. And that's where you need that flexibility to respond to good or bad. But most of all, I think the evaluation of good or bad government policy is probably the wrong one. Just assume that you've got a government policy backdrop which can change quite rapidly. And your question, the question for businesses is, can I respond quickly enough? What have I got in the way of flexibilities of my business planning, which allows me to say, okay, right, okay, well, I think it's good, I think it's bad, it doesn't really matter, you're running a business. So the evaluation good or bad is irrelevant.
So you paint a pretty not exciting picture, a pretty dark picture perhaps. So what do you do? So if you're an energy company, what do you do? And what if you're a large consumer user, you're a large enterprise that uses energy? What do you think is going to happen? What do I do for the next 6 to 12 months? What kind of strategy can I do?
Well, one, I think a lot of people need to realize that this is an opportunity. You know, what I'm talking about is the fact that we've got bad infrastructure and we haven't updated it. The other side of the coin I mentioned at the start is to do with technology. I will emphasize this to my dying day. We have the technology. It's a matter of applying it, subsidizing it, so, you know, incentivizing it. You know, for instance, you know, one of the devil works that I've seen over the particularly last 3 decades is no one wanted to do hydrogen because it's too expensive and too many risks and blah, blah, blah. We abandoned nuclear because we don't like it. And you know, Germany was above all at the forefront of it. We can't just, we have obstructed, particularly all the world big development banks, World Bank, EIB, EBRD above all, African Development Bank have obstructed carbon capture schemes. Now we're suddenly having to say, well, maybe we need to rethink all of that. There are opportunities for everyone to look at this and look how they can improve it. Look how much, you know, as an example, aluminium is incredibly energy intense. Now the aluminium sector is basically using the production process for processing aluminium to produce alternative energy. That's all the things that people can do. And a lot of it has been, it's been sitting there. But people, well, yeah, but it's not going to, you know, is that going to fund our next share buyback, next big dividend, another big bonus for the directors? Nah, it's a little bit too, you know, intensive. Now people are going, well, maybe we should have looked at that more. And so as much as the picture I'm painting is of the current situation being quite bleak, I actually would say, on the other hand, that means there are so many opportunities. It's not true. And people just need to get out there and start getting creative and looking at how best, you know, if you're going to have to live with slightly, well, markedly higher energy costs, are there other areas in terms of digitalization of your business, the automation of your business, which there's been a lot of resistance to, which you could use to offset it? So it is getting, you know, lateral and critical thinking and becoming adaptive. I think one of the problems we had with the whole just-in-time, you know, processes and globalized processes is we thought we could do everything and we had it sorted out. It's a little bit, actually, when one thinks about the pandemic, we actually had thought we wouldn't really ever be hit again by something like polio or tuberculosis, because we've got it licked. Well, we did. We had a huge lesson in health security, and we're now getting lessons in energy security, in technology security. This is really, it's the wake-up call of going against the vested interests which have resisted the deployment of technology in a lot of areas, because that's very much part of the problem. They don't really have much of a say now because they're not the vested interests. That's when you seize your opportunity. That is the opportunity, because those vested interests don't have the ear of government anymore because they're not delivering.
So touching on this and following up on this, I think I can understand if you're a big aluminum plant, you start looking at how can I utilize the energy and how can I make my plant more efficient, my own kind of business. And you could probably tie that into this quarterly economics for a company. You do an investment, maybe even a PPA kind of a setup, whatever kind of a short-term solution. All right, it's not going to change the landscape of energy, but it's for you. So that I can understand. The one thing, though, is you mentioned also infrastructure, that we're lagging behind, at least in many countries, on the actual infrastructure. You also mentioned that the politics is short term, which I think we all know. It's 4 years usually, and it seems to be turning around quite quickly as well. Different inputs. So how do you see this mix between we need a long-term infrastructure plan because energy is infrastructure in many, many, many ways. Technologies will solve parts of it. But who should own this? Because we had on the show a little bit, how do we solve this? If it's an infrastructure problem, is there an interest for companies because it's a very long term, or is this actually something for government that changes every 4th year? This is any ideas around this? It's complex, but
well, there's two things. One, a lot of the energy things are concentrated in urban environments. It does obviously actually impact the rural environment very heavily. For agriculture, energy costs are absolutely critical. It's not, but I think in terms of getting greater consistency, and this was an idea which was put forward by the United Nations a number of years ago, certainly at a couple of conferences I attended. What we need actually, because at local government level, and particularly big cities, which have much greater connectivity than people think in terms of government. So a New York, a Sydney, a London, a Paris, a Berlin. And I'm not taking away, if I've forgotten places in Asia and blah, 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 it's not because I'm neglecting them, but we are focused. But they have a much greater stability in government. And that's really where it needs a lot of the ideas. There needs to be much greater cooperation at that sort of level to implement this, apart from anything else, because it impacts the urban manufacturing and services environment that much more than, to a certain extent, the rural. So there is, that gets over what one has in terms of whether it's the federal or national government, the problems with dealing with that and those bad cycles. And that's certainly something which needs to be built on. But I also think, we need to move away because part of the problem here is lobbying. Any country you care to think of, we think of it lobbying mostly in terms of the United States, but it happens in every single country in the world. And what we need to probably factor in is, that lobbying to preserve the status quo. If no one's learned the particular lesson at the moment, lobbying for the status quo is basically regressive. And at the corporate level, that's where the pressure should be, to be, instead of going to lobby governments for keeping your own bit of the pie, which if you really think you can preserve it, and many people have had brutal lessons in the last year, 2 years, I should say, since the start of the pandemic about, you thought actually you had something pretty much stitched up for yourself. Well, here's something to come on, question it. So the lobbying needs to be started in a different direction and pressure governments, particularly the ones who are very populist and very sensitive to anything, any opinion polls, to basically say, right, roll up to your sleeves because we've got a job to do. And if we don't do it, we are actually going to hit a brick wall and you will be voted out in any case.
but it seems that sometimes, like Brexit, let's take Brexit. Sometimes the die is cast outside, right? I mean, that die kind of get cast. There's consequences, I assume. So how does something like that play into what we're talking about today? So let's use Brexit as a specific example. How is that impacting maybe the UK compared to some of these other markets you've been talking about?
I don't think, in terms of energy, in Brexit impacts the UK above all in terms of the workforce. That's the most brutal part. And as much as I'm not going to be particularly loved here in the UK, the fact of the matter is there has been this cycle of picking on various groups of foreigners in the UK, whether it was the West Indian migrants in the 1950s, those from East Africa and India and Pakistan and Bangladesh during the 60s and 70s, whether it was the Australians and the Kiwis during the 1980s and 90s, and then in the noughties and tens, against EU nationals. The UK needs those people. It is very reliant on the foreign workforce, but that's not the problem in terms of that's not, the problem on the energy side in the UK is the whole privatization process of utility provisions. It's created a structure which is just basically unviable. So that ended up with the result that, particularly in terms of gas, the UK cut because it basically just didn't, there were no incentives for Centrica to keep all that storage capacity because of the way that the market was being structured. And therefore they cut their capacity, and they believed that they could trade their way out of it. What they forgot, of course, is, what happens if everyone needs to go and pick up more gas because the weather's getting that much more extreme, and we've got disruptions of supplies. So in terms of the UK, it is pretty much the same problems as Europe, except with a problem of it hasn't actually dealt with investing in its infrastructure. The whole privatization process of the utilities and the provision of domestic utilities is nonsensical, to be quite honest.
So I've heard you say now, at least twice in this interview, in a derogatory kind of manner, that trading yourself out doesn't seem to work. It seems to be a poor strategy. Is that a takeaway of what I'm hearing from you?
What I'm saying is, if you think you can trade yourself way out, if that's your working assumption that you can trade your way out, which in a lot of times you could, that's very, very true. But we're not there now. We're not in that sort of space. We've gone from the post-Cold War, even actually pre the end of the Cold War, an age of plenty to an age of scarcity. And so if you're assuming you can, if we're now moving into an age of scarcity, of intense competition for resources, which has been flagged for a long time. If you actually look at what's the impact of China on the whole global economy, that's been coming our way, and we just were in denial about it. The stronger that China became as an economy, and this is also true about the other great hope, and I really hope that India really does come on leaps and bounds to the sort of levels in terms of reducing poverty and providing better employment and education and healthcare systems and better infrastructure, that it does. But that's going to increase their demand for resources such that we're now in a much more intense environment. So therefore, relying on trade, I think really the lesson of the pandemic is the other lesson is make sure you aren't, and this is Germany's most brutal lesson, make sure you're not running concentration risk. If you're sourcing everything from the same place, make sure you have a backup plan, even if the CFO says, yes, but if we have a backup plan and we need to store more, that costs more. That means there's not so much money for dividends, for shareholders and bonuses and blah, blah, blah. And I don't look so efficient because this is an efficient way. Well, it is an efficient way. This is have your alternative supply chains. Make sure that those supply chains are much more diversified. This is really where we're going with all of this, that, semiconductors would be the other brutal area we've seen. We make semiconductors in 3 countries in the world in terms of mass production. Wasn't that wasn't very, very clever. There was no thinking. This is where, the pressure from business on government needs to happen, and also internally in terms of the way businesses are structured and planned, to actually say, maybe this isn't a good idea, that cheapest is best and the fastest route is best. And I need to be able to say, right, I've got a failover. I mean, if one thinks of it in networking terms, what we've done pretty much above all in the energy sector is we've built this super network, and it's got a bunch of single points of failure in it, which, from an IT perspective, you go, you've got this many single points of failure in your network. What are you thinking? So that's really, what this sort of, to use an analogy, this boils down to: too many single points of failure.
Makes sense.
So touching on this one, I know we're coming up on time, but I questions are just flowing. I really appreciate it. But maybe just summarizing a little bit. We talked about India. We talked about China. Obviously, massive economies, a growing middle class. The use of energy will be. We don't even. I don't even know where it's going to end up. But we see the demand. Then we start looking at the corporates. Okay, we tend to live in a quarterly economy where we need to deliver on a quarterly basis. So once we start matching this, and this is a big question, so if you can try to summarize a little bit. So how does this affect, in your words, the energy transformation? Because we also know, I hope people on this show at least, that we need to move towards sustainable energy. We need to move to a world. So how do you think this is going to work? A corporate suddenly needs to say, you know what, I cannot look at this quarterly because I need to make sure that I have a backup or a diverse plan of my energy, which will cost me money. So the CFO will be okay, but that's what we need to do. The developing countries will say, yes, we have a growing area. We would need to do this for sustainability. Or do you think this be like, all right, we'll do it, but on the cost of the energy transformation?
I don't think it should be the cost of the energy transformation. I think, though, there should be no sacred cows on this. 84% of the world's power comes from hydrocarbons. What all this idealized political talking has done, whether it's Glasgow or anything else, it's never actually looked at practicalities to create the sort of infrastructure for power supply, and that's really what it all boils down to. We are going to basically have to burn a lot of hydrocarbons. It really depends on how quickly we want to do it. So let's plan it and let's get on with it. And for corporates, it is this opportunity to actually look at things and say, right, I do need to transition. So in that process, I need to make sure I've got better alternatives. And also at the same time, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, the bulk of power supply for the time being is hydrocarbon based. How can I, at my individual level, my individual corporate level, look to transition that much quickly? What can I do to facilitate it? Are there other companies who may not necessarily be competitors in my area who we could club together with and look how we could maybe deploy solar power, biomass? I don't know. Anything that there are so many alternatives, and it is much greater cooperation which is required, and not looking at it in terms of what's going on in my industry. This is what I mean by going from micro to macro thinking and saying, right, it's in our interest to make sure our area, our region, our country, our state, whatever it happens to be, at what sort of a level, to make it better. How can we do that? How can we facilitate that? And by cooperating together with other corporates, how can we then pressure both local government and national governments to put in laws? Because in a lot of cases, some of the transition to the energy transition, it's because there's no legislation being passed. Baltic states, there is no biodiesel in the Baltic states, not because they are against it. No one bothered to pass the legislation. And that's where the corporates really can come in and say, come on, guys, sharpen up.
Well, for me, Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. We've been all over the place. It went where I hoped it would go. We've got a nice perspective. I really hope that we're able to get you back on the podcast again, because I think there's a lot more that we could talk about. I saw Johan writing questions pretty much the entire time you were speaking, and he only asked a couple of questions, which for Johan is really hard. So I really appreciate you joining the program. I hope our audience did as well, but thank you so much for being a guest today.
It's been absolutely my pleasure. Great to chat with you both.
And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as we have. We think it's timely. We're trying to get more timely information out to you as quickly as possible. If you like this content, please share it, subscribe, And don't forget to comment on it. And we look forward to speaking to you again next time. Bye-bye.